观众朋友您好，欢迎您收看《生活》。今天为您介绍休斯顿第5代华裔张伟明回到他的家乡广东开平寻根的故事。张伟明出生在美国，除了长相是中国人之外，他既不会说中国话，也不是中国人的思维方式。但是他说他的根在家乡开平。
Well, when I was a teenager, I hated being Chinese. I just couldn't stand listening to the elders speaking in Kaiping. It just really irked me to hear that. Even going to the Chinese restaurant, the smell I didn't like it at all. And I always think about being American, you know, children's football. Los Angeles Lakers, that kind of thing. I never felt being comfortable being Chinese. Being a teenager was really rough for me. Being Chinese in an American high school, it was not in my mind to be Chinese at all. So that's why I felt when I was growing up. Even when I was an adult, up to the past 10 years, I always had some hidden resentment about China. So I remember even my mother and father, they never spoke to me in Chinese. They always spoke to me in English. Even my grandfather, unless he got mad at me and cursed at me. And that's why I had this sort of resentment about being Chinese. I just didn't really feel comfortable at ease being an American with a Chinese face. So I always try to pretend to be American, to think American, act American. But now things have changed since in the past 10 years.
参天之木必有其根，环山之水必有其源。姓氏是人的符号标志，是家族血脉的传承。追本溯源、寻根问祖是中华民族的传统美德。近几年来，为了探究我根在何处，始祖何人，祖籍开平赤水镇瓦片村的美国第5代华裔，现为美国德州休斯顿市政府土木及交通工程师张伟明，不远万里，屡次从美国飞回故乡开平寻根问祖。在2003年之前，张伟明对自己的祖籍在哪儿、家族还有何人、家乡是什么情况等都一无所知。促使他回乡寻根问祖的原因，是因为朋友的过世。2003年，他的爱尔兰籍好朋友在美国自杀身亡。他去帮忙整理朋友的遗物时，发现他的朋友竟然保存着很多跟家族有关的物件和信息。当时张伟明很感慨，因为他对自己的家乡和家族都毫不了解。此后，他脑袋里不断浮现的就是我是谁，我从哪里来等问题，而且挥之不去。为此，张伟明通过多方收集资料，最后得知自己的家乡是广东开平。从2007年开始，他就着手策划回到故乡寻找家族根源之旅，目的就是到父亲张姓和母亲于姓的村落中研究其祖辈的根源。
It started on January 30th, 2003, when my friend committed suicide at that time. And it was a change in the way I was thinking. It was a way for me to look at myself in a different way. Instead of America, I went back to China. I went back to find my roots, my ancestral roots. And I have a series of discoveries during my over 10 years of journey in looking at my roots. My forefathers, my ancestors, come from the village in Kaiping in Guangdong province in China. And since that time, I have gone through all over America looking for traces of my family here in Gold Mountain in America. Then eventually I went back to Kaiping in Guangdong province. First time was in November 2007. where I met my fellow villagers at Longonli in Kaiping. And at that time, I discovered I have 500 new relatives of Zheng surname relatives from that particular village. And what I found out since that time is a great story of the legacy of my family of over 100, almost 150 years here in Gold Mountain. When my great-great-grandfather Zhang Bengyao came to America, Gold Mountain, to work on the Transcontinental Railroad. Later, in 1892, Zhang Pulan, my great-grandfather, came to America, to Boston, Chinatown. In 1912, Zhang Zhaoshao, my grandfather, came to San Francisco in 1912. And in 1932, Zhang Bonxin, my father, arrived in Boston. So this is a story that I've been learning myself about my family here in America, but at the same time, I found my roots in China. So I've been here in the past over 10 years looking for my roots, both in America and in China. Well, going back to my great-great-grandfather, Zhang Bengyao, he came to America with my other cousin at that time. Then we went back to Kaiping in 1869. He went back to marry his second wife and built his Gold Mountain house and raised his family back then in Kaiping after he finished the Transcontinental Railroad. Zhang Pulan, my great-grandfather, well, he went to Boston, Chinatown, as I mentioned before, with his brother at that time. And he got into more interesting business. He got into gambling hall. He got into opium den. At that time, it was very popular for the Chinese men to spend their time outside work in gambling and in smoking opium. So my great-grandfather was very successful in gambling and in opium. So he went back to the village to retire later. And then in 1912, Yang Zhaoshao, my grandfather, it was his turn to go to Gold Mountain. And he arrived in Boston later. But first he went to San Francisco in Chinatown to learn English from a Miss Ida Green Lee in San Francisco, Chinatown. And he was living in Chinatown on DuPont Street, or Grand Avenue as it was known back then. And during that time, the Chinese depended on being clan members, being family members. There's all called referrals, a lot of connections with different families. They depend on each other to support each other because it was very difficult to live in America. A lot of discrimination, a lot of bias, a lot of hatred against the Chinese. My grandfather, Yang Yaoshao, eventually went to Boston, Chinatown, established a chop suey joint called the Royal Restaurant in Boston, Chinatown, at the heart of Chinatown. Then eventually he started another chop suey joint called the Imperial Restaurant over on 2nd Square in Cambridge. So he was busy in the restaurant business, serving not just the Chinese, but the Anglo-American community. So that was what he was doing back then. He went back to China in 1921, got married to my grandmother, and a year later, my father, Zhang Baoxin, was born in 1922. In 1923, Zhang Yaoshang went back to Boston to work in the restaurant again. And then later, in 1932, when my father was 10 years old, he left the village of Longonli to never go back to China, but to leave for America and arrive through Canada at the port of Vancouver, travel across the country on a steam train, took a steamboat from the port of Yarmouth to Boston and arrived in the spring of 1932. Because of the illegal immigration, the illegal discrimination against Chinese, it was illegal for Chinese to even come to America. It was very difficult. They had to figure different ways to come to America. And one scheme is called the paper son and paper father scheme, where people bought false papers that my father was a paper son of a gentleman called Chung Hong Kwok, who was his paper father. So he came illegally through this paper to come to America in Boston in 1932. He lived in Boston, Cambridge from 1932 to 1936. Eventually, because of the Great Depression, my grandfather's business, the Imperial Restaurant, failed. So eventually in 1936, both my grandfather, Moi Chung in Cantonese, and Jim Sui Chong, my father in Cantonese, left from Boston to Los Angeles. From there, they live and work in Little Tokyo, next to City Hall in Los Angeles. They stay in a place called Yokhon Lo. And because they had relatives, they took care of my father and my grandfather at that time. My grandfather worked as a waiter at the Far East Cafe in the Yokhon Lo, in the chop suey business in Little Tokyo. My father attended high school, Belmont High School, graduated in 1940. Eventually became an aircraft mechanic. In 1943, he began to work for Pan American Air Railways as an aircraft mechanic for the famous China Clipper seaplane that flew from San Francisco to Hawaii. When he left the service, he became a partner of the Kubakan Theater Restaurant at the gateway of San Francisco Chinatown at 414 Grand Avenue on Boyd Street. Kubakan was a place where there was good food, a combination of American Chinese chop suey food, good dancing to Latin music, great entertainment, singers, dancers, strippers. 3 times a night, people would eat, dance, and dine the finest food. But going back to why I go back to China, what interests me? Before January 30th, 2003, I was your classic Juxing, a banana. I looked Chinese, but in my mind, in my thoughts, I was very American. I didn't care to be Chinese. I was very embarrassed to hear Chinese spoken. I didn't want to think about China. I thought China was primitive, backwards, ugly. But everything changed, my paradigm, the way I thought. And suddenly, I realized China was calling my heart to go back. I had this magical pull for Kaiping. Because of my family background, before January 30th, 2003, I knew nothing about my forefathers. I knew nothing about my father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, or great-great-grandfather. All these tales, stories I just told you, I knew nothing before that time. And during that past over 10 years, it's been a journey for me to find myself going back to China, finding my roots. I didn't realize really that I came from Kaiping. I never knew about Longgonli, my ancestral village. I never knew about my relatives. I never knew about the secrets, the tragedies associated with my family. So I remember the very first time I arrived in my village, Longgonli, in Kaiping, in November 2007. We drove into the square and we jumped out of the van and said, we're here in the village. And suddenly everybody jumped out from the ancestral hall, the elders, the kids. They knew something was happening. An overseas Chinese, a fallen leaf, has returned to the village, me. They knew who I am. They knew about my father, Yang Bonchen. They knew about my grandfather, Yang Jiaoshao. They knew about my great-grandfather, Yang Polin. they showed me my own house, the 9th house on the 6th alley. They knew about my stories. My father had left in 1932 and never came back. They still have memories of my family 75 years later to this very day. And since that time, I learned so much. I discovered so much about my roots. I knew about the dialogue, the castles in the sky. I learned about the history of my ancestors going back to 776 AD. I know when the village was founded in 1466 AD. I found the burial grounds, the ancestor tombs of my ancestors in Feisun, the Hill of the Flying Swan. So I learned so much about the village, the culture, the lifestyle. So it's been a wonderful experience. I had opportunities to do film with them, to do stories about the village. I have written many articles about my time, my discoveries, both in America and China. Before that, I never knew about Kaiping. I had no clue where exactly it was in my geography, in my mindset. But now I cherish the people I have, my relatives in that village, in Longgongli, in Kaiping. I'm very proud to say that I'm from Kaiping. Well, I remember the first trip I went to the village. I went to my house, the 2-story gray big house on the 9th house on the 6th alley, and we found some old dishes that was used for daily living, inscribed with their names. It was found on the loft on the 2nd floor in the cabinet where I found these dishes. That's what I discovered at that time.
Oh,
this man here, his grandfather was my great-grandfather's partner at the store in Basha back in the 1920s and 30s. So I met him on my first trip. My second trip to Kaiping, I found my family tree book, or called Gaipu, and it shows that my family extends to 776 AD. I'm generation myself 43 since the beginning of this particular book. But the most important thing was on May 8th, 2009, on a Friday, we did a kind of a Qingming ceremony where we honor our ancestors. We did our respectful ceremonies at the ancestral hall, at my house. Then we went up to Feiyosan, the Hill of the Flying Swan, where we honor my ancestors in the ancestor tomb. What I have here is a piece of soil from that particular Hill of the Flying Swan. This is where my ancestors are buried. And in this plastic bag is the flora, the leaves from that particular forest where that Hill of the Flying Swan is located, where my ancestors are buried. My father was a quiet man. He never talked about his past. He has so many secrets. He never told me about anything about Kaiping, about the village. To be honest, my father and I, we never had a good relationship. We never talk about China. We never talk about his life. So all these years, I've been discovering his amazing journey in his life, both in America and China. And that's why my heart is to know more about Kaiping, to know more about China, to know the people. I remember there's something warm, friendly about the people, so humble, so different from any other place I've been to. They're very caring, they're very nurturing. They care about me, I care about them. There's something intangible I can't really describe, but there's something, the way they are, the villagers in Longgongli. I want to help them, I want to showcase them, I want to show them the best light, but I love that place, Kaiping, and my heart is always to go back to Kaiping. So on my last trip, I went to explore a little bit more of my great-great-grandfather, found his Gold Mountain house when he came back from America. I found some interesting picture I found in the trunk of my relative's house next door. It sat there for maybe 60, 70 years, this picture, and I restored that picture of my granduncle. And that's another treasure, another clear moment. Well, one part of my journey is I have a great passion about writing about Kaiping. And one effort I did is a book of poems called Plum Blossom Love Poetry between Dragon Village and Gold Mountain. And it has many poems of what I believe are the virtues, the beauties of Kaiping. It has many stories about love, about paradise. And there's one story I relate to in a poem called A Long Lost Love. And it's actually a true story. From 1923 to 1966, my grandfather, my grandmother were separated for 43 years. They did not see each other. In 1923, my father left my grandmother as a young mother. Fast forward in 1966 in LA, in Los Angeles, an old woman. And somehow, during the course of those 43 years, they still had their love together as husband and wife. And because of that, I composed this poem, A Long Lost Love, by张伟明. During restless sleep in Gumsum, claps of thunderstorms awaken me. My dreamy mind recall a long lost love I left in Kaiping. Why can we not share our lives? Why can you not stay with me? Why can you not feel my love? Why are you so far away from me? I will never depart from you. I will never say goodbye. I would never love another woman. I save myself for you. So it's been a great plus 10 years of experience to be a person discovering my roots of my forefathers back to China from America. It's been a great journey discovering all the dark secrets that I unfolded, the paper sons, the second wives, the discrimination. It's been a great learning journey, but to think about myself before very American, now Chinese. And it's because Kaiping has a special heart, a place in my heart. So every time I think of Kaiping, I think of the people, I think of the village, I think of the beautiful landscape. It's just a place, it's a paradise, an oasis that's unlike any other place I know in America or in China. I want to someday live there in that place in Kaiping. Because my heart, now I realize, is to be drawn back to China.
这期的生活节目就到这了，感谢您的收看，我们下周同一时间再见。